Hi, I'm Conor Byrne, and this is That's What I Call Marketing, the podcast where you will hear from the leading lights in the marketing world and listen to their unique stories. Today, I'm joined by the truly brilliant Peter Field. Peter is known as one of the two godfathers of effectiveness, along with Les Binet, and that comes down to the work that they have done over the past 10 years plus to push for more effective marketing through evidence from the IPA database. Peter and Les authored the influential Long and Short of It, Balancing Short and Long-Term Marketing Strategies. And Peter joins me today to mark the 10th anniversary of that publication. We talk about what led to writing the book, the context of when it was written, some misconceptions and frustrations, and also some of the things that are holding firm 10 years on. This is a wonderful episode with someone who has truly reshaped marketing for the better. Enjoy. Peter, thanks a million for joining me on That's What I Call Marketing. Great to see you.
Lovely to be here, Conor.
I'm going to start, in case anybody doesn't know who is Peter Field. Can you briefly tell me who is Peter Field?
I probably need to just go back a bit to answer that, because to know me, you kind of need to know that I have a science degree in engineering. So there is a science side to me. But I realised that wasn't going to give me the kind of career I wanted. So when I graduated, I went into advertising, as you would. Obvious segue after an engineering degree. Horrified my parents. But what I was looking for was something where I could bring the discipline of kind of science and learning, if you like, to a much more creative arena. And the job that attracted me was planning, account planner in a leading agency for planning at the time. So it was the perfect role. You know, you got to do research and learning and try and put a bit of science, but into a discipline that was undeniably primarily a creative one. Yeah. And I think that is the real challenge here. And I think this is the most important challenge that I think we increasingly face in the world of marketing, is being able to draw on the science to the extent to which it can help us, but to know that if we really want to hit the high spots, if we really want to be as effective as we need to be in the modern world, you've absolutely got to add some creativity, some creative magic, some inspiration to that. Rule books cannot take you to where you need to be. They can get you partway there. They can make sure you don't make dumb mistakes, but always you have to allow free play and some space for for creative leaps, because they work in unpredictable ways. So that's what really brought me into it. And I spent about 15-16 years as a planner, kind of learning that lesson very slowly. I'm a slow learner. But then after 2 redundancies in advertising, I thought, this is, I've clearly kind of reached my sell-by date. So I started my own business. And for the last almost 30 years now, I've been a consultant and advisor, initially to very briefly to the advertising world. I soon realized that actually what I really wanted to do was to work with marketers. So for most of the last 30 years, I've really been advising marketers and appearing on platforms, written a number of books. Most famous books are with Les Binet, but loads of others as well, about effectiveness. And everything I do is based on analysis of effectiveness databases, whether they're in the UK or Canada or Australia or global databases. But I like to work from an evidence-based kind of approach, because that's where I think the real interesting action comes from. It gives me a chance to steal other people's brilliance. Really. That's the best thing about it. So hopefully that's kind of me. That's the best bits of me. I won't tell you what the worst bits are.
Well, look, one of the, today we'd love to talk about the 10th anniversary of The Long and Short of It, which is, an incredibly well-known publication, as you said, that you wrote along with Les. I'd love to maybe paint the picture of 10 years ago, because, marketing landscape is different now. What was it like then? What was marketing challenged with, I guess?
Well, I mean, the real challenge that we were addressing in the long and the short of it was what I call the fog of performance marketing. I mean, we had in the first book that we wrote together, Marketing the Year of Accountability, which was about 5 years earlier than that, we had kind of spotted and made passing mention of the fact that the long and the short term effects of advertising can be quite different. But we really didn't have enough data to dig deeper than that at the time and start to follow that through and to examine the conflict that we had already begun to realize might be there. So fast forward to 2013 when we published The Long and the Short of It, and it was abundantly clear to us that the world of marketing was going down a really rather dangerous track, that it was becoming more and more short term, more and more focused on just those nudges to get people over the purchase line, bottom of funnel marketing, effectively, and that brands were beginning, and they were only beginning to at that stage walk away from brand marketing. So the long and the short of it was, hence the name, a very, very deliberate attempt to say, look, there are two effectiveness worlds out here. There's the long and there's the short. Each are valid and important in their own ways, but they pull you in totally different ways, different directions in terms of strategy, in terms of media, in just about every way it is possible to think about. So if you're not aware of this tension between the two, if you're not aware of the fact that they are different, you can make some really, really big mistakes. And we were beginning to see that then. We were beginning to get worried about a growing trend to short-termism. But of course, it had only really begun then. Everyone was still absolutely hooked on the Kool-Aid of performance marketing. People in big tech companies were saying, look, the brand is dead. We don't need brand building anymore. It's expensive. It's inefficient. It's so last millennium. We just want to focus on using data to serve these last minute messages to people, because that is just awesomely effective. And of course there is a huge misconception in all of that, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about. So it was a big mistake being made. We sensed it. We didn't begin to know how bad it was really in 2013. It subsequently got a whole lot worse, and the long and the short of it wasn't a hit from day one. It took certainly 5 years really to get any momentum going, because I think people didn't really want to hear the message. Those who criticised it said, this is kind of old fogies thinking. Les and Peter, they're old enough to be my granddad. They can't possibly know what's going on in the world. But I'm happy to say that I think really over it started before COVID, but COVID, I think, was a help in a wake-up call sense, because of course, the moment you hit recessionary fears, everybody goes short. But also around COVID, there was some, just before and during COVID, there was some very high-profile admissions and discoveries by big high-profile brands like Airbnb and Adidas that there were real downsides to going too short and not building your brand. So I think probably about 4 years ago, suddenly the theme of long and short started to get some real traction, particularly in the US as well, where we failed to make any inroads. So it's kind of just built. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago, was it globally famous? I certainly couldn't have said yes, but I think now just about. I think it is quite well read and well known now. But got a bit of a long haul, hasn't it been?
No, because I think it's important to remind ourselves of that context. Because actually, interestingly, there's possibly people listening to this today who, their marketing career may just be 10 years, and so they're not, aware of the context of what was going on before and how the, I guess, proliferation of digital channels was taking over. I mean, you'll remember this as well, where agencies were, you were either a digital agency or you were, an above the line creative agency, and the pitches were, well, no, you can't go for that pitch because you're a digital agency. Like it was a very broken up industry, and there was a lot happening. And look, not to say there wasn't good work in some of those spaces and good ideas, but I think it's first really important for people to get the context.
Well, I mean, Les and I have always tried to be quite clear that when we talk about long and short, we're not imposing a digital divide here. There's
Yeah.
no reason why, you know, established traditional media channels have to be good at long, and why new digital channels have to be cast as short term. It just happens that to date, anyway, the new digital channels with the data utilization that they open up have been particularly good at driving short-term effects. And because of that, the models that particularly the platform owners have advanced. I mean, Facebook has been talking for more than a decade, really,
Yeah.
about its model, its best practice model, which is all about the short. So they've, in a sense, shot themselves in the long foot, as it were, if I can torture a few analogies here. Because they were so good at helping to drive short-term effects that their whole thinking, the whole way they encourage people to use, the whole monetization of their platforms was all geared around that and made them inevitably, because if you've read the long and the short, you will know that if you focus on just the one, you undermine the other. Inevitably, those platforms have become not as good as they could and should have been at building brands. So the digital divide has been, in part, a self-inflicted kind of issue. It doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be, and it can't be going forwards. But that's just the way it's turned out.
Yeah, and we're starting to see some of those platforms and looking to find ways to measure the impact of brand, over time. And I guess what's interesting with this is when you think about it, it's 10 years since the long and short of it. And, it in itself has probably taken the time it's required because there's more data now available to kind of prove some of the things that you were looking at. At the time you used the IPA effectiveness database as your core source of information. What drew you to that as the source of data?
Well, I mean, I helped set it up 30 years ago. I mean, it was when we were setting it up, and this was many years ago. I mean, more than 30 years ago. I did a round of interviews with the great and the good, academics, practitioners, people like Simon Broadbent, for instance. And the desire was to have a body of evidence that rose above individual case studies, which everyone could shoot down. Because if you said, "Oh, look what Apple did," everyone says, "Yeah, but we're not like Apple." You can't. So what we wanted was to coalesce the learning into a body where you had respectable sample sizes, where you could start to say, "Look, there is some robust quantitative evidence that there are, kind of certain observations we can make about effectiveness." That was the desire. That was about 30 years ago. We started to set it up, but it takes a long time to collect the data. So I was, very closely involved in that,
Right.
as was Les. So we designed it from the bottom up to do this. It wasn't, in a sense, a question of being drawn to it. We wanted to have an evidence-based point of view. We created the evidence base, the two of us, over a period of about a decade, and we were finally able to start mining it, really, which we did for Marketing Year of Accountability almost 20 years ago now. So these things do take a bit of a time. So it was designed to be used in this way. It was great. But since then, I've moved on, and I've worked with the Australian equivalent and the Canadian equivalent, and I've worked with WARC and global databases.
Yeah.
So they are all fascinating in their different ways. They often lead us in very, very similar directions in terms of findings, which is reassuring. But they are all, of course, databases of effectiveness. They're all tend to be databases drawn from campaigns that were effective to some degree or another. And that, of course, has given the critics of this kind of analysis a nice way in, because they can say, "Oh, well, this is all these are outliers, special cases."
I was
which
going to ask
annoys
you
me
about
intensely.
That. Yeah, I was going to ask you.
I mean, it's a kind of really dumb thing to say, isn't it? On a lot of levels, really. I can kind of understand why academics might do this, because, of course, academics have been taught, and this is one of the big limitations, I should say, of a science approach and marketing science, is that inevitably it leads you to ignore and, in fact, be very concerned about outliers, because outliers don't kind of generalize. So we can't. The thinking is any learning you might seek to extract from outliers is dangerous, and they should be ignored. Now, anyone who has spent any practical time in marketing will realize what a dumb kind of observation that is, because it's the outliers that teach us to move forward. If we don't study the outliers, we can't be exceptional. So I'm totally with the marketing scientist in the sense that there are some basic rules of marketing that we need to get right, because if we don't, we will make some big mistakes. And a lot of big mistakes have, of course, been made in the past by people who've ignored those rules of marketing. But the point about rule books, the point about the science bit of marketing, is that the rule book is open to anyone and everyone. And increasingly it is used. If you work at certainly the blue chip marketing level, all of these big companies, whether it's Mars or Procter & Gamble or Unilever, are all very, very aware of the kind of dumb mistakes that you can make. So they're not making them.
Right.
So it becomes a level playing field again. How do you, as a marketer, move beyond the average, or what I would call the mediocre? Because you can be, you can get by with being mediocre in marketing to some degree. But most businesses, and this is particularly, of course, the case with the number 2s, 3s, 4s, the challenger brands in categories, you cannot afford to be mediocre. The brand leader might be able to afford to be mediocre, but the challengers have got to do better than that. So they've got to be exceptional. And if you're all playing by the same rule book, you're all doing the right things, you're all communicating the same category entry points, you're all making sure you max out your reach, and all those other bits that marketing science teaches we have to do, where is the competitive advantage? How are you going to create one? You're not. And we know from work that Nielsen did many years ago in packaged goods, we know that on average, typically, a challenger brand has something like a 3.5 to 1 disadvantage versus brand leaders. That is to say that every euro above equilibrium that a brand leader puts into its communication, its advertising, it will get about 3.5 times as the gain as a challenger brand.
Right.
Now, these are pretty heavy stacked odds. We've always known that big brands, brand leaders have an advantage in markets, but that puts some numbers to this. And I think it's just a simple and terribly, terribly obvious observation that if you are that number 2, 3, 4, perhaps 5 brand in the marketplace, and all you're doing is emulating the same behavior as the brand leader with the same rule book, how the hell are you going to win out with odds like that? So you're not. So you've got to learn from the exceptions, the outliers. That's one of the reasons I admire the work of Adam Morgan so much, because he realized this long before most people did. He's 20 years ago or so, he wrote Eating the Big Fish, which is really about particularly how challengers need to learn to beat these odds. And that you learn from case studies of success, not from studying normalized, science, normalized behaviors. Only by doing that can you overturn odds of 3.5 to 1 against. Because we know, for instance, that creativity can give you a 10 to 1 advantage. If you pursue related approaches, the FAME strategy, for instance, that gives you something like a 5 to 1 advantage. These are the tools of leveling the playing field when you're a smaller brand. So you've got to do it. So, this is my pushback to anyone who says, forget the outliers, forget case studies of success like the IPA or the FIS, because they can't teach the average brand anything. I say the average brand desperately needs to learn this, because the average brand is screwed, frankly. If they don't learn from this, it's a very, very expensive place to be average if you are not the brand leader. And it's not great even if you are the brand leader. You open yourself up to challenge, frankly. So I think everyone's trying to be better than that. So, I admire, for instance, hugely Mars as a company.
Right.
Because if you look across Mars portfolio brands, they do the science bit. They're very, very, into all of that. But they absolutely understand the need for some creative magic. Procter and Gamble, exactly the same.
Yeah.
Procter and Gamble, I think, know when and how to turn up the creative firepower when they need to, and they've got some great case studies. Of course, you can't always guarantee to do it. That's the whole nature of creativity. That's why it doesn't generalize. That's why anyone who studies
Yeah.
vast databases of the average brand will probably not get the same strong signals about the power of creativity, because it cannot generalize. By definition, you cannot have a category full of highly creative brands. There can only be one or two in that category who are doing something completely original, because the original soon becomes the normal.
Yeah.
So, that's the nature of it. Great strategic thinking cannot generalize. It's always going to be different and exceptional, I think. So,
And when you talk about creativity, so yeah, it's kind of like the science is you need to know. The creativity then is probably where you're going to excel. But I know from other things I've read and listened to with you, is that one of the things that might frustrate you about 10 years in is the misconception that you're just saying it has to be traditional advertising is the way to do that creativity. Am I right in saying that?
well, there's been a certain amount of that criticism. I think Les and I have been fairly clear. I mean, we've always tried to include in anything we write and work some good examples of digital creativity, and they are there, and increasingly they're there. So I certainly don't think that it is all about traditional channels. It's just that we have misused digital channels so much.
Right.
Even when we have got very creative with digital, it's tended to be very much following a short-term kind of agenda, instead of trying to be trying to build brands, use creativity, because that's really what creativity is good at. It's a brand building tool. It's about creating enduring and motivating memory structures that last way beyond the last view. I mean, that's the value of it. If you don't have creativity, if you have very unmemorable marketing, you've just got to keep pumping it out there. That's where the always on model came from, because your advertising was so goddamn dull and boring that unless you kept pumping it at people, it couldn't work through the across multiple purchases. So but it's not just about traditional media, but it remains the case that I think probably traditional media has made better use of it. A lot of the great creative case studies, creative effectiveness case studies, still have got strong elements of traditional media. But let's be clear, I mean, almost no campaigns these days are exclusively either established or digital media. Almost always they use both, and it's increasingly a debate about how you use both.
Yeah.
So I'm a very, very big fan of those limited number of companies. And I've often referred to Geico, for instance, the American insurance company, as being a good example of a company that's said, look, we've got to find a way of building our brand using digital online video. So I'm big fans of that. And I think they've done some interesting, good stuff. But we know the challenge, because academics like Karen Nelson Field in Australia, she was an academic. She's now got a very, very successful company that's all about attention economy. We know from her work that the reason why it has proved so difficult to build brands on digital platforms is simply attention spans. Attention. You've got to get a certain level of attention for a period of time, and
seconds.
And her threshold is 2.5 seconds.
Yeah.
She says only after 2.5 seconds of attention do you begin to build memory structures. That is to say, do you begin to build your brand? And of course, many digital platforms haven't been able to provide that. She said 85% of she tested 130,000 ads, just average ads, some social, some not social, but all digital ads. And only something like 15% of those actually achieved that threshold. And most of those who did achieve it only just achieved it. So you can kind of see the challenge. But Les and I have never said that has to be the way. It's the way it's turned out, just simply because of the inadequacies of the way the platforms have worked, and they've monetized their product, and the thinking that's gone on around it. And frankly, I think if more there've been more thinking that comes from traditional media, like posters, for instance. I mean, to make a successful poster work, it has to work in a matter of seconds. It has to be eye-catching in the right way, seductive in the right way. It has to be able to land a message with a relatively fleeting glance, and to reward people who actually want to linger and come back to it. So, the whole point about posters is great posters have to be outliers. They can't rely on half a second of drive-by noticing. They have to make you want to avert your gaze and come back and do more. And when you think of some of the great campaigns, mostly sadly in the past, that used outdoors in that way, they were talking points. Absolutely got people looking and talking about them. We don't do enough of that these days, but that's the kind of thinking that I think you need to start applying to make digital platforms work better. And it could be done. It could be done.
Yeah, I think harking back to agency days where you'd out of home was being designed and it was being looked at on a screen or maybe a printout, but it was being looked at completely out of context of that. I used to want someone to run past to the poster and go, right, tell me what you saw after like the 1 or 2 seconds, and I think that's also a thing with probably digital assets that we create is we look at them on a deck or in a presentation and we're going, on a big screen or whatever size screen, you go, that looks great, but it's the context. I don't know why we don't do enough of that. Why do you think we don't do enough of that kind of contextual viewing of advertising to help us inform decisions? I know there's testing platforms that can help.
But... I think that's exactly the problem. I've recently done some work for the Newsworks in the UK, who are the trade body that represents news brands, what we would have called once newspapers, but are now increasingly digital platforms in the UK. And, the only way you can explain the continuing, in fact, growing strength of news brands as advertising platforms is the context issue. It is a trusted context, and it's particularly trust. We've known for years that the context in which you see advertising influences your response to it. And that's always been a strength, particularly of kind of the news context. But that of course has massively accelerated in recent years, since what I will call the fake news era. Since we started to realise, and it's kind of Trump, Brexit, all of that. It happened about 6-7 years ago, I suppose, or started. And people started to realise that just because they read it online doesn't mean it's true. Whoa, wake up, guys. So I think that realization has become much broad. And that means that where you get a medium where there is a greater belief in the trustworthiness of the content around it, that rubs off on the advertising. So context is vitally important. And I think that's another thing that's undermined advertising effectiveness in many of the digital platforms. Because if you're surrounded by fake news, toxic news, all sorts of dodgy players, it inevitably alters the sense in which, as a recipient of a piece of advertising, you kind of are prepared to take it on board and not shut it out. If your mental guard is up because you're in an environment where everything is dubious, then that's going to apply to advertising. So context, really important. We need to do a whole lot more of it, measuring it, but it's damn difficult. How do you do it? I mean, if I had an answer to that, I'd happily share it with you, but I don't. I mean, I think it's perhaps a role for AI, the right kind of AI, that for once would be us using AI to good advantage, rather than, I'm sure, all sorts of bad advantages it's going to be put to in the years to come. But that would be a good purpose for it. If you could train AI to, in some way, make an objective assessment of the context in which advertising appears, then that would be a really useful kind of metric, and it would be a great way of monetizing, kind of charging for the ads. It's not just about how many eyeballs did we get. It's not just about what Karen Nelson-Field is quite rightly fighting for, which is what kind of attention level did it gather, which is also very important. That, of course, she can measure. But the third ingredient would be, but what was the context value? Was it supportive of the advertising message, or was it destructive of the advertising message? And if we could measure that in some way, I think it would be another great metric to our arsenal, and it would drive the quality of advertising environments upwards, hopefully, and try and incentivize the filtering out of kind of bad fake news and toxic content and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and I guess to not hark on about TV, but like there is an advantage of TV that you can buy around context. I think to Hovas Go On Lad, and when that was done, they bought the 102 seconds. I may get the numbers wrong. 122
120,
seconds.
I think.
Yeah.
It was it was a mega ad.
They bought, like, they worked with ITV at the time, and they bought it around Coronation Street because it was the most viewed, and it was all, and that would play well to the heritage of the brand as well, I imagine. So like that is a very probably strong example of that context. Now you can't always get it, I know that with TV, but it does help having the context.
Yeah. No, well, just not to let that point drop for a moment, but we should move on. You're right, but I think in the old days, when I first started in advertising, first of all, media and creative hadn't been separated. So the media guys, and they were very much guys in those days, could have a conversation with the account team or the creative team and think about ways in which media choices could enhance the creative route. And so those kinds of initiatives happen much more readily when you get that kind of cross-fertilization. So the divorcing of media thinking from creative thinking has been a big nail in the coffin of that kind of inspired thinking. But of course, there's another big thing as well, which has killed that kind of really productive line of thinking, which is, of course, programmatic. And the more we move down that way, where we're just buying on, kind of price and eyeballs, no value is placed on the fact that this ad for, say, a new tech launch is going to be placed in an environment of white hot technology, which of course will enhance its message. That there is no value placed on it. It's simply a question of, well, we're going to get the right eyeballs, for the right money. It's a much dumber way of buying media than the old-fashioned way was actually when it was done well.
Yeah, and I've seen things like smart bidding and Performance Max, drive. And this is actually a really interesting point to think about metrics, but drive results at a better cost, whatever that was in the context I was looking at it. But it makes me think about the way we're measuring things. And as I, look back over your work and, was reading on it more, I was like, is that kind of fundamentally part of the problem? Are we measuring things in the right way? Or are we kind of going, well, this is our measure, we want to get cost per this, at this and with these many people, and then like goals drive behavior, right? So people go 100 miles an hour to get that thing, and the quality isn't being captured.
No, you're absolutely right. And we did, again, it was one of the things we warned about in the long and the short of it, and we particularly focused on the challenge between efficiency and effectiveness. And of course, the absolute defining metric that we started to warn about that poses this threat is ROI. And of course, we have a marketing world that doesn't just measure ROI, and it's a perfectly sensible metric to measure. I'm not for a moment saying we shouldn't measure it, but it's when it starts to become a target, it starts to become the thing we chase, then ROI becomes lethally dangerous. And I'm not hyping this. It is lethally dangerous. It kills brands, because ROI teaches you to go short, to go for low-hanging fruit, to simply chase what I would call mediocre results with minute budgets. That's the way to max out ROI. Whereas, of course, effectiveness is very different. Effectiveness is about maximizing outcomes, particularly the profit outcome. And what we showed and argued in the long and the short of it was that if you pursue ROI as an objective, you tend to weaken profit. And a lot of people can't get their head around that at all. You really have to think about it. But, people were warning marketing about this, long before we ever wrote that book. I mean, one of the advisors to the setting up of the IP Effectiveness Data Bank was a brilliant academic called Tim Ambler, now retired, but happy to say still very much alive and well. He warned us 30 years ago not to chase ROI precisely because as a ratio, you have two ways to max ROI. It's a ratio of what you get back to what you put in. And the easiest way to maximize that ratio is to put less in. And if you do that in the right way by going short, that ratio starts to take off. But actually, the important way is to ensure that you're always keeping an eye to what you get back out, the level of profit you generate, as opposed to simply the ratio of profit generated to the costs incurred in doing it. And he warned us then 30 years ago, and we should have done what he did, because we've spent the last 30 years grinding brands into the ground, driving them into the ground by pursuing ROI, which is an efficiency metric at the cost of an effectiveness metric. And it's just to look smart with the accountants, I think. It's really dumb.
I was going to ask you about that, because I think that is a fundamental challenge that a lot of marketers face. And I'm guessing you've met a ton of CFOs and CEOs over the years, but particularly in the last 10 years with the publication, the book. How are you having that conversation with them?
Well, a lot of people, I think, CFAs kind of get a bit of a bad rap, don't they? And I understand that. I've always found that when I've had the opportunity to get in front of the C-suite of companies, whether it's, CFOs, CEOs or whatever, I've always found CFOs, and CEOs, of course, are mostly people who were once CFOs. So we're talking about the same animals in many ways. They're perfectly open. They're intelligent people. They're perfectly open to an evidence-based argument. And I've always found that if you can put an evidence-based argument that alerts them to these dangers and gives them a sensible, credible way forward, that at least you can create the opportunity to try it out. I mean, obviously, you've got to deliver at the end of the day as a marketer, but at least you can create that. I've not come across any CFOs actually that just stick their fingers in their ear and say, I'm not listening, this is all marketing airy-fairy nonsense. Because I think if you've got an evidence-based way of proceeding, then they're reasonable, intelligent people, they will listen to you. And I think that has been marketing's weakness in the past, because it hasn't been evidence-based. It's very much been, just trust me. You've got to marry the two. And, we're kind of coming full circle here, because this, of course, has been one of the values of marketing science, in that it does generate an evidence-based to support some of the really important tenets of growth driving, like the building of mental availability. And of course, that is a very important one, because mental availability is essentially another way for saying we've got to build the brand in the right ways, at least. Building a brand requires budget. We know that brand building is related to share of voice, or particularly extra share of voice. So it has all sorts of implications for investment levels, as well as strategy and media. So it's a useful, proven construct to add to the evidence base when you're trying to put an evidence-based argument to a CFO that you need to invest in the brand. So it's very useful on that level. It's just taking it to the next level of saying, yes, but we need our advertising to work harder than our competitors if we're going to win this battle. And I think that's where the marketing science sometimes leaves us rather short.
Yeah, you mentioned extra share of voice, and I did want to ask you about that, because that was a theme that came out of the book. Can you just explain that to somebody who may not have heard that before?
Yeah, sure. And I would just say that a lot of people suggest that Les and I invented the extra share of voice, and we absolutely did not.
I've heard Les say that.
No, John Philip Jones, I think, is the man who probably deserves the credit. But there were lots of work was being done on this by Unilever and other researchers long before that. But John Philip Jones was probably the guy who formalized it into, academic grade papers and research. So he did that in the 1990s, long before we put pen to paper. So we absolutely do not claim credit for that. We simply observed that it worked very strongly in the data we were looking at, that at the time, and I'll come back to the update on this in a minute, but at the time, the relationship between ESOV is simply the difference between your share of voice, your share of category expenditure across all advertising platforms, and your share of market, measured in ideally financial terms. So if you have a 10 share of market and your share of voice is 11, then your extra share of voice is 1 percentage point, difference between 11 and 10. It's as simple as that. And what we found, and what John Philip Jones and other researchers found over many years, was that it was that metric, the difference between share of voice and share of market, that either drove growth or resulted in loss of growth, loss of market share if share of voice was short of share of market. John Philip Jones observed that it wasn't entirely a straight line relationship. It's an unfair world, as we've already been discussing. It's a curve that flattens off. So big brands can actually get away with lower share of voice and share of market and still drive growth. That's one of the ways in which they get this 3.5 multiplier over lesser brands. It's kind of more, it's obviously much more complex than that. There are context issues as well. So we simply observed that exactly that occurred in the IPA database that we worked on at its peak. And I will say that its peak coincided pretty much with the advent of the very beginnings of the performance marketing revolution for reasons I will come to. So if we're talking about 2008, around about then, when performance marketing was really beginning to get going, at that point, the relationship in the data I look at between ESOV and market share growth was unbelievably strong. You absolutely could predict market share growth based on it. It was a very, very strong, highly correlated metric. Since then, what's very interesting is that correlation has absolutely eroded away. Now, what I'm at pains to point out is that doesn't mean to say that the relationship between investment in brand building and market share growth has weakened. Right. It just means two things. One is that thanks to the walled gardens of the digital platforms, we can't measure share of voice as reliably as we can. So we can't really know it. So inevitably, the metric has become more noisy, more unreliable. So that's undermined the relationship. But also, more and more of our spend, our share of voice, if you like, is not about building mental availability. It's not about brand building. It's about short-term sales activation. Right. And Les and I advocate the 60-40 rule, 60 brand, 40 short-term. Many brands around the world gone way beyond that. You're lucky, frankly, if you've even got 40-60 going on. I mean, often it's 20-80, maybe 30-70. So you've got vast amounts of that supposed share of voice that isn't doing anything to build the brand at all, and therefore is not driving long-term market share. All it is doing is driving short-term market share. So because of that absolutely cast iron relationship between ESOV and market share growth has massively weakened over time. So I think to correct that, we need to do two things. Firstly, we need to know much more accurately exactly what our share of category expenditure is. But secondly, we need a share of brand voice, not a share of total voice, because that we need them both. We need share of brand voice, share of activation voice. We need those as separate metrics. Right. And when we've got that, we'll work out how to combine those two to create a new effective share of voice measure that will teach us, teach us how to measure the metric and able to guide our investment and predict growth. But at the moment, we don't have that. There's work to be done.
I was going to
there's never not worked.
Yeah. Will we get it? I mean, because part of the challenge is, as you say, walled gardens.
Yes. Well, we've got to break them down. We've absolutely got to break them down. And marketers have got to keep driving at this. We've got to have reliable metrics. And, and I think that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in Karen Nelson-Field's work. And, I think you have the basis in attention, at least, to develop a parallel metric. At the moment, she advocates attention weighted share of voice, which I think is a very useful advance. But really, what actually we're driving at, what we really want to get ultimately, is a measure of share of attention, that we generate, because that actually is what we need to know. And when we have that metric, I think we'll be able to make lots of much smarter decisions about the media we buy, but also about the level of investment. So, if I have a very, very creative and therefore very, very effective piece of advertising, my share of attention is going to be way ahead of my actual share of spend. And I might use that information either to drive astonishing growth or simply to drive very profitable growth by scale. So, without the metric, we can't be certain, and we can't get it right. So I'm very eager to push that kind of particular issue forwards. I think it's a really important metric to build.
Yeah, and valuable to everybody, right? In the sense of not just the advertiser, but the platforms, right? Because ultimately, I think they're trying to evolve. I was listening to the debate on, it was a debate about double duty, and in Australia there was an example from News Corp. They had done a Shandong piece of creative that seemed to do both brand, both performance. A really interesting just discussion, on that. But again, you're looking at a platform kind of, I think, coming to the table and saying we need to do more. We need to actually evolve and not just kind of sit behind units.
Yeah. And that is good. And, I think this issue of double duty, I'm still nervous about. I accept that maybe if you've got a very smart platform that can deliver in kind of both the requirements of the long and the short, it can deliver high attention, brand building capabilities on the one hand, but it can also deliver data-driven, highly targeted platform on the other end. And I think someone like a big news organization like that may well be able to do that. But you've still got a fundamental challenge to the ads that you might run on it, which is that when you're talking about brand building, you've got different strategies, different targeting, different media requirements to when you're talking about sales activation. They are very different worlds, very broad targeting, probably longer form emotional messages that build brands on the one hand. On the other side, you've got very tightly targeted, probably quite message related functional kinds of nudge messages that just make you do the buy now on the other hand. So they call for very, very different placements. So it's actually much more difficult than people make out to do effective double duty advertising. And I think usually what you end up with is something that does neither very well. And I experimented with this when I was in agencies many years ago. I worked on a lot of bits of business that did direct response as well as brand. And we always wanted to try and do it. And every time I tried to do more creative brand focused advertising to drive short-term responses, it failed. And every time we put too much responsive stuff into the brand building, it weakened the brand. And I kind of, in a clunky way, learnt there and then, keep the two separate. Do each really well. Find a way of integrating them, of course, because you want to evoke the brand when you're doing activation. And when you're doing brand building, you want to try and steer and set people up to the activation where you can. So integrate sensibly and intelligently, of course, but just recognize that they're totally different tasks. It's very difficult to do them together.
To me, it comes back to like the objectives. Like, what are you trying to achieve? Because if it's sales tomorrow, you need to do a different set of things. And if it's, future demand, as James Herman calls it, or just long-term brand building, you need to do different things. And you've talked about, emotional, rational fame. I want to come to a question that Paul Dervin, who you know well, put to me to ask you. He said, it feels like more ads in a media plan are shorter formats than 10 years ago. It's hard to create emotional-led advertising in 6 to 10 seconds. You probably need to do it in 3. Any thoughts or recommendations on this? And you mentioned Geico as a good example already.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, that's that. Paul Dervin is one of the smartest marketers I know, and he's absolutely put his finger on it here with that one. It is, of course, really difficult. I don't think it's impossible. I like what Geico have done, for instance. I think they've shown that you can, to some degree, in short format, do engaging brand building work. You've just got to think very cleverly about it. And if we accept, which I entirely do, the Karen Nelson Field finding that you've got to work to trying to get more than 2.5 seconds of attention. So that means you've got to provide some kind of reward or lure to the viewer. You've got to make them want to carry on watching, because it's too easy to scroll past. And if we're simply relying on unscrollability as our compunction for viewing, that's not going to work. I mean, people have eyes. They are able to avert their gaze or close their eyes or just mentally ignore you. Sorry, digital guys, that is possible, So you've got to get back to enticing people to want to watch your advertising. That's of course what Geico have done well, but you've got to recognize, and I think that's why the poster format, and I had an interesting conversation some years ago with a very bright guy from Mars about precisely this, that their thinking was poster when it comes to digital brand advertising. And I think that is absolutely the right way to think. With a poster, if you've got a good poster, you might get 2-3 seconds of viewing. If you're lucky, you might get a bit more than that if it's a particularly good one. If you're very lucky, you might get people talking about your ad, so that actually you even drive. And that's where you have to try and go for. You've got to try and create that kind of advertising. And again, this just brings me back to the difference between activation advertising, which could be just communicating a single thing that will make you click, but it's not going to build a brand, and it's a very ultimately inefficient way of doing it. So you've got to think in a separate way. And Paul's question is absolutely right in saying you've got to find a way of making it emotive in some way, because if it's not emotive, it's not going to be memorable or compelling, or certainly it's not going to become a talking point, because people don't by and large talk about facts. They talk about cool stuff. Hey, whoa, have you seen that amazing ad with, I don't know, the dog doing whatever? Those are the things that people talk about. And the advertising message kind of comes through, if it's done well, on the back of the cool creative. So again, let's be clear, coming back to marketing science, there are those who would have us believe that the formula for success in advertising is simply going down a checklist of category entry points, just tick them all off. And that's great if you're a brand the size of McDonald's. It's very de-risked. You can go down that. You've got tons of money. You can say, we're for high days and holidays. We're for Granny as well as Junior. We're here for breakfast, lunch, and supper. All of those CEPs, we can tick them off, because what, we've got billions. But most of the brands I work with, they don't have that kind of budget. They read these marketing science edicts about CEPs and about universal reach of the entire target audience. And they say, look, I'd love to be able to do that. I buy the value of doing that, but I haven't got the euros. I haven't got the dollars to do it. So give me another way forward. And that's why, I keep coming back to this model of emotive, famous advertising, because what we've always found with, and those are the kind of creative formats that Paul Dervan knows so well, and has been so good at, working to develop off the back of the science, is when you develop these kind of iconic pieces of advertising that just stand out in the categories, the category entry points just come to you automatically. It ceases to be a checklist, because you are the brand in the category that everyone's talking about. It is assumed you are good for all occasions. It is assumed you are good for all people. It is assumed you are going to be here, there, and everywhere. They just come with it. And there are lots of great examples of case studies in effectiveness databases, not just the UK one, of brands that done that. You look at their advertising, and if you're lucky, there was one category entry point in there, if you're lucky, but they became so popular and so iconic within their category that they show you the data. They say, look, our reputation across all sorts of things just leapt as a result of this. You get it without having to do it mechanically. So, these are the important lessons we need to learn. And I think that is why it is worth struggling to find ways of doing the digital piece more powerfully, so that we can use the reach of digital and the flexibility of digital in many ways to enhance our brand. So yeah, good question from Paul. I would expect nothing less.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I was just thinking I saw an ad on Twitter for Storm beer, and it was a very simple, like a GIF almost of a guy holding a can of this beer, and just obviously a wind machine blowing his face as if it was a storm, and it was arresting, and probably wasn't that expensive, but it looked good. I was like, that's good. So it's possible to do good. And one of the others, as you talked about the cases, I think Specsavers is probably a wonderful example, and they probably have tons of money. But like Vet is a brilliant, phenomenally good ad that's probably 10 years old, and they've just been consistent. And so they then do the mix of the brand building and then the short term activation. For me, anyway, exceptionally well. And I think their business has shown the results of that.
No, absolutely. But also, if you talk to the team at Specsavers, as I have, there have been periods when they've walked away from this, and quite recently.
Right.
And nothing's safe in this world. It just takes the next marketer to pitch up and suddenly decide that all that brand building it's a bit expensive, and I can use data just to target people who are searching for an eye test. Why would I build the brand? And of course, Specsavers have good reason, more than many brands, to learn the value. I mean, I often use them as an example of a brilliant example of the profit value of long-term brand building, because it's a stellar achievement they've done. And I'm happy to say they are now getting back to lovely brand building again, having had a little bit of a window from it for a while. But I mean, some of their old ads, like Vet, for instance, was so powerful. It's a great example of an ad that just worked for many, many years because we all loved it so much and remembered it so much. But again, it says something. Great creativity isn't just about entertaining, amusing, memorable stuff. It's about that, but anchored in something that the brand delivers. And of course, the great thing about their campaign, Vet in particular, is absolutely rooted in the idea of the importance of good vision and the offering that the brand had on that level. So, it is in many ways, I think, the absolute paragon of virtue of great creativity. It's the alignment of creativity to commercial purpose. And of course, that's where often creativity does go wrong. But I think increasingly we're kind of learning that message. But yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And I've always loved it. And, their more recent advertising is getting back to form. And I think they'll go from strength to strength.
So look, we're coming to time, but one of the things I did want to ask you is, a lot of marketers are facing into difficult times, whether it's recession or not, who knows, but there's definitely challenges to marketing budgets, which probably is going to lead to, well, we're going to reduce brand spend, we're going to just focus on the short term, although people may not call it that. What advice or what would you give to a marketer facing into that? Like, how can they address that with their leadership?
Well, the first thing is to look at the evidence, and all the evidence says that you should not walk away from the long term from brand building. Going short in a recession is dumb on two levels, really. First of all, it means putting more money into probably a channel which is going to become more expensive in recession, not less, to drive a lower volume of sales, because in a recession everything is likely to be, markets tend to contract. Not all, but many do. It's done on that level. But secondly, the learning is that the big opportunity you have in recession, because typically brand building media tend to get cheaper, is a cheaper way of reinforcing your brand so that when the recovery comes, you will come out with all cylinders firing. And so the evidence says that the brands that continue to invest in brand building through recession come out of recession with massively greater strength than they went into it. And it is a unique and extremely low-cost period in which to leapfrog your competition and build your brand and drive growth. So you walk away from a great opportunity. Now, that's not to say there aren't balance issues between brand and activation that need thinking about during recession. I'm not saying walk away from short-term activation. There will be a need to kind of keep the revenues coming and to parry anything your competitors will be doing. But the daft thing to do is to walk away from brand building. And we know anyway that brand building turbocharges the short-term activation. So if you want to carry on trading during a recession strongly, you really need the brand to help your performance marketing do its job. But the main thing is to keep doing both. We know that because media often gets cheaper and because some of your competitors are going to be dumb enough to pull out of brand building, that you may well be able to maintain your share of voice or even build your share of voice with less money. So you may still be able to bank a few euros and keep the CFO happy. But still maintain this critical metric, which you've absolutely got to keep your eye on through recession, which is what is your share of voice, and particularly obviously your brand share of voice, if you can measure that. Because if you're not maintaining that, you're going to come out of recession weaker than you went in, and you'll be coming out with diminished margins anyway. So it's a dangerous place to be. So, let's not make that mistake. People make it every recession. They get their fingers burnt. All the success case stories in recession are from brands that stuck with the advertising, stuck with the brand building. So let's do that.
Hear. And there is evidence, so encourage people to seek it out. You've written about it, others have as well. So I think you're right. The evidence is the key because it's there and we need to use it.
Yes. Plenty of people have written about it. If you have a look through LinkedIn, you'll find references to lots of other papers, academic papers as well as non-academic papers. Ehrenberg Bass have done work on the danger of brands going dark, what kind of market share you can expect to lose, and other researchers have done work on that as well. There's a great research paper that was published after the global financial crisis. I think it was about 2009 or 10 by two American academics, Tellis and Tellis. Definitely get hold of that. The trouble was they published their paper when the recovery was on. So everyone said, oh, boring. Why would I be interested in recession? It's a brilliant paper.
Is that the Harvard Business Review one?
Or
maybe it was excerpted in it.
Yes, there's quite a few papers out there. It's really worth doing the trawl and getting hold of them because there's been a lot of work done on it. But it all points you in the same direction, which is don't disinvest in your brand. It's really dangerous. It's superficially seductive. You may well be able to boost your ROI numbers in recession, but I hope if I've done just one thing in this podcast, is to alert you to the dangers of pursuing ROI as a metric, because it'll kill you. It absolutely will kill you. Measure it, be aware of it, but don't target it because it leads you to a very slippery slope of short-termism, low-hanging fruit, easy, quick wins, and not building a brand for the long term. And recession is the classic environment where people do that.
Yeah, I think you said to us at one point, it's killing brands and killing businesses. So that's a high risk strategy for people to pursue. So
definitely,
Peter, what a great point to leave it at. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Great to speak to you on the 10th anniversary of The Long and Short. But last question, did you think at the time it would have the impact and legacy that it's had?
No, I mean, I think we had hoped it would have its impact rather quicker than it did. I mean, it's a long time coming to get to where it got, more than 5 years before it really started getting widely read, and most of 10 years before it absolutely became well known. We had no idea it would be as influential as it has been. We certainly hoped it would be influential, but it's exceeded our wildest dreams, and we're relieved to some degree that that's the case. But if only it had happened sooner, it might have saved a few dollars out there.
Yeah. Well, I encourage people who maybe haven't read it to read it, and some of the other work that you've done as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much,
Peter.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks. Bye now.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode and getting to spend an hour in the company of one of the true greats in marketing. I'm lucky that I had spent time with Peter Field before, and what is wonderful is the Peter Field that you saw or heard today is the one I'd met before, and it feels like the really authentic version. He's passionate about what he does, and as you can tell, has some strong views like ROI. But he is also open to new evidence, but there has to be evidence. It was a real pleasure interviewing Peter Field today, and I hope you enjoyed it. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening or watching That's What I Call Marketing. If you did enjoy it, please do share and add comments with your feedback. You can get in touch and find all previous episodes on that'swhaticallmarketing.com. Follow us on Instagram for short videos on That's What I Call Marketing, and on Twitter where we talk about all sorts of different marketing stuff. That's_marketing. And now you can watch our episodes back on YouTube. And you guessed it, you'll find us by searching That's What I Call Marketing. So from me, Conor Byrne, until the next episode, take care.